Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Climate Council special briefing on Aim High, Go Fast. My name is Dr. Martin Rice. I'm acting CEO of the Climate Council. I say acting because our fearless leader, Amanda Mackenzie's had her second baby, wee baby boy. And so just like to congratulate Amanda and Sam on that really exciting news. So before I introduce the panelists, first off, I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people as the traditional owners of the land in which the meeting is taking place this evening. I'm here in Brisbane. I recognise the country north and south of the Brisbane River as the home of both the Turrbal and the Yagara nations. I pay deep respects to all elders past and present and future. I extend this respect to the traditional owners of the land from where you're all joining us tonight. So thanks, everyone. I mean, I know that we do have guests joining us from across the country today. So I'm very excited to introduce the panelists. This report, Aim High, Go Fast, obviously, it's very timely. It's leading into a major international climate summit, the COP26 in Glasgow in Scotland. And it's been a year in the making, and I'm delighted to have co-authors Professor Steffen and Professor Lesley Hughes. Many of you in our community will know Will and Lesley. So both are world-class respected climate scientists. Will's actually, he's been involved in and survived, I should say. He's reviewed and contributed to no less than five intergovernmental panel on climate change assessments. And he's also coordinated major global programs on climate change, and he's been at the interface of science policy and a founding member as well, one of the commissioners, as you know, and a climate councillor. Lesley Hughes, she's up there as well with the IPCC and has contributed enormously to that assessment as well, and has been a founding member, a commissioner and a climate councillor as well. So Lesley's also Pro Vice Chancellor at Macquarie University and has many hats as well. But we're really lucky to have Will and Lesley here. So Will, he's going to present essentially the science and unpack the science on our Aim High, Go Fast, present the key findings. Lesley will talk about, she'll have a bit more of a good cop approach, and she'll present a little bit on the impacts, but look at our recommendations as well as the solutions. And Dinah Arndt is our strategic communications director. Dinah has a wealth of experience as a trained journalist, and she's also got colourful language as a trained journalist as well. So we really look forward to Dinah actually explaining how to really unpack and run through the conversation guide. There was a lot of work put into this report from a comms perspective. So talk about the research done and interesting findings when we're going through that. So she's going to essentially present how to have conversations that cut through. So also there's you can put your questions in the chat box there. Sadly, the chat box doesn't do translations for Scottish accents, so you're going to have to put up with mine this evening. But let's move quickly on to Professor Steffen. So Will, if you don't mind just going straight into the science, please.
So this is the global average surface temperature from 1850 to the present. I'll go through this quickly. You can see for the last half century, it's been rising at an accelerating rate. We're currently at 1.2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. And the rate at which temperature is rising is 0.24 degrees Celsius per 5-year period. That's an extraordinarily rapid rate in Earth history. We haven't seen this before except for one other time. When you look at Australia, we're heating more than the global average. That's true for all the continents, but particularly for this one. And you can see that the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO data for 2019, which is marked here on, I'll show the cursor here, we already breached the 1.5 level, or the Australian equivalent of a global 1.5 degree temperature. And over the past 5 years, our temperatures have been at the very upper limit of the model projections. So the shaded area here is what the models are projecting the high values and the low values. We've pretty much been tracking recently towards the middle although sort of at the upper end there. But the last 5 years have been extraordinary in terms of the heat that we've been experiencing. And it's these spikes here that Lesley's going to talk about in terms of the impacts, particularly on the natural ecosystems. They simply cannot cope with that, in particular, the Great Barrier Reef. When you look toward the future, we're already committed to a certain level of climate change in the future. And that's because of the inertia in the climate system and also the inertia in human systems. So global temperature will continue to rise for the next 10 to 15 years at least, regardless of the emission scenario that we follow. And you can see this on the graph. This is actually from the AR5. The IPCC AR6 has not been released yet. So these projections start from 2005, but you see that the very lowest projection and the very highest projection do not start diverging until really about 15 years or even 20 years into the future. So this actually means that given the current rate of change and where we sit today at 1.2, we are committed to breaching 1.5 degrees within the next decade or so. The model results from AR6 were released and published by Carbon Brief late last year. And when you look at the low emission scenario, 2.6, and the high emission scenario, 8.5, and the two in between, all of them are going to breach 1.5 in terms of the median year of breaching, somewhere between 2030 and 2033. So that's pretty much the story. We're not going to avoid 1.5 without overshoot and drawdown. So we need to plan for that. You can also look at it from a carbon budget framework. The carbon budget is based on the fact that the temperature rise is approximately linear related to the cumulative amount of CO2 emissions. So that is from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, taken here as 1870, which is roughly the 1850 to 1900 average. The cumulative emissions that we've emitted correlate quite well with the global average temperature. For example, somewhere around 500 billion tons of carbon give you about 1 degree temperature rise, and that's pretty much what the observations show. So we can use this relationship then to develop a carbon budget to say if we want a temperature target like 1.5 or 2 or below 2, the Paris range somewhere in there, we can then calculate how much more emissions we're allowed to have before we have a good chance of staying within those temperature targets. So this is the budget for 1.5, is that from 1 January 2018, when the IPCC special report on 1.5 their carbon budget was published, we had 570 billion tons of CO2 that we could still emit. Now, obviously, we're down the track a few years. So the observed emissions for 2018, 2019, and 2020 amount to 125 billion tons of CO2. So already we've chewed up a reasonable amount of that budget. That leaves us with 445. But then you have to account for non-CO2 gases because these carbon budgets, while they're based on CO2, they make the assumption that we reduce the other important greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide at the same rate we do CO2. But it's generally considered that it's more difficult to reduce these. One of the primary sources for both of these is agriculture, and it's much harder to get emissions out of agriculture than, say, electricity generation. So we've taken a pretty conservative estimate there that we have to reduce our budget by about 90 billion tons of CO2. That's about 2 years worth of emissions. That takes us to 355. But the difficult one here is the carbon feedbacks, which are not in the IPCC models. These take the form of permafrost loss. The most recent literature on that would argue that our number here is probably conservative, but it also includes deforestation of the Amazon and also fires in the northern forest. There's quite a bit of literature on that, but it's difficult to model it. So we have to do this offline. And so the number we came up with was 245 billion tons. That leaves us with a budget of 110 billion tons. Our emission rate pre-COVID, and in fact, unfortunately, it appears we're bouncing back to about this rate in 2021, is 43 billion tons of CO2 per year. That means the budget would last only 2.5 years, or with a linear rate of emission reduction, it would last 5 years. So that's clearly impossible. We're not going to meet that. So again, it's just consistent with the IPCC models, which are saying that we will breach 1.5 somewhere between 2030 and 2035. But depending on how one interprets the Paris climate target, the goal, the primary goal, the way I interpret it, is well below 2 degrees. That's what everyone signed up to. So we can actually do a budget for well below 2. And here I've taken 1.8 degrees C as well below 2. And the good news there is that, yes, this is probably achievable. So if we go through the same calculations, budget of a bit over 1,000 billion tons of CO2. These are, again, the emissions for the 3 years that have occurred. Here's the non-CO2 gases. Carbon feedbacks are a little bit higher because if permafrost is forced at 1.8 rather than 1.5, you actually lose more permafrost. So we take that into account. Still, though, our remaining budget is 405 billion tons of CO2. And at the current emission rates, that budget would last about 10 years. But with a linear rate of emission reduction, we could achieve net zero emissions by 2040 globally, cut emissions by 50% by 2030, and have a good chance, a 2/3 or greater chance of keeping temperature well below 2 degrees. So that is basic, and I emphasize that these are global numbers. So averaged globally, we need to get emissions down by 50% by 2030 and hit net zero by 2040. So in a way, it's good news that over 100 countries are now pledging net zero emissions by 2050. That's a good start, but that will need to be ratcheted up as we go forward to achieve that by 2040. So the Paris Agreement, global average temperatures are currently about 1.2 above pre-industrial levels. We are on track to exceed 1.5 in the 2030s, and we can no longer limit warming to 1.5 without significant overshoot and drawdown. So we're not saying that we can't possibly get to 1.5, but we're saying we cannot do it without overshoot and drawdown. So there's the wording in the Paris Agreement is to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 and to pursue efforts to do better, 1.5. We don't attempt to actually interpret this. There are various interpretations of it. But we do acknowledge that the long-term stabilization of global warming at or below 1.5 will be extremely challenging and will not be possible without significant overshoot and drawdown. But that temperature, the Paris Agreement, however you interpret that temperature range, we must continue to strive toward that goal. It's a very important goal to meet. And I think we still have a shot of doing that. So the science bottom line is climate change is indeed accelerating with deadly consequences. In just a minute, Lesley's going to talk to you about some of the risks and impacts. The ecological systems that have sustained human societies are being severely damaged or eroded. It's nowhere more obvious than here in Australia that this is the case. There is no safe level of warming. Every fraction of a degree matters, and that's why I really emphasize quite strongly that 1.8 is better than 2, probably significant better than 2. So it is really important that we keep warming to well below 2 degrees. And as I said, we can still do this, but this does require that we really start moving. We can't have another decade like the last one. We have to have immediate, deep, and sustained emission reductions. That, in fact, is what the substance of our report is all about. Global emissions must be cut in half this decade and reach net zero by 2040. Fortunately, momentum is building around the world for significant climate action. It isn't there yet, but it's moving in the right direction. We really must support and step up efforts to focus on the big, deep reductions that we need to take this decade. So I'll stop there. That's just the basic synopsis of the science. And the message in a word is urgency. No more time to waste. We have to get on with the job now. So over to you, Lesley.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Will. Very sobering account there. And yes, as you said, Lesley's going to now talk about the impacts, what's at stake, and the solutions. And I just want to thank the many joining tonight. There was lots of solutions on the screen share there to get Will's PowerPoint up and running. So thanks for that. Lesley, over to you.
Can you see that screen, Martin?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, great. All right, good evening, everybody. I'm coming to you from the land of the Wallumattagal people and the Darug Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And it's great to see so many of you online. Well, as Will said, my task tonight is to very briefly talk a bit about the impacts that we've already seen from climate that we've already had, but also talk about some of the solutions that are outlined in this report. So firstly, what's at stake of the temperature rises that Will's just been talking about? Well, as Will said, we have already had global warming of 1.2 degrees. Here in Australia, because of our latitude, we've actually warmed by the end of last year 1.44 degrees, according to the Bureau of Meteorology. You will all recall, of course, the Black Summer bushfires. We're really entering into this new age of megafires. The use of the word unprecedented has been unprecedented. Those fires were a shock to all of us, but they should not have been a surprise, because it's the sort of series of events that scientists have been talking about coming for a long time. Last year, when we were all going into lockdown, another shocking bleaching event happened on the Great Barrier Reef. It was the third bleaching event in 5 years. It didn't get much publicity because we were all focused on COVID, but it has now knocked off about 50% of the hard coral on the Great Barrier Reef, which is really one of the world's greatest natural icons, of which Australia has stewardship. Many, many other marine and terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems are also undergoing massive changes. We're losing the Tasmanian kelp forest, for example. We've seen huge changes to mangrove systems, to moss systems on Macquarie Island, to river red gums along the Murray River, and many more. And if you're interested in this particular topic, I would recommend you go back and look at a report that we did a couple of years ago called "This is What Climate Change Looks Like," which is all about the observed impacts of climate change on Australian ecosystems. But climate change is not just an environmental problem, it's also an economic problem, of course, and we know now that the economic costs of extreme weather disasters have more than doubled since the 1970s. We can no longer call these natural disasters. They're not natural at all. They are human-made. We are also seeing impacts on agriculture. So, for example, in the Murray-Darling Basin in the southeast of Australia, we've seen somewhere between a 30 and 40% decline in cool season rainfall over the last 3 decades. Similarly, enormous drops in rainfall in the southwest wheat belt. So agriculture is being affected, and of course, those ongoing fire risks. But it's not just in Australia, of course, it's the rest of the world, and some of our nearest neighbours are the most vulnerable. So many Pacific Island nations, which are on islands that are very, very close to sea level, are already experiencing multiple and compounding impacts of climate change. Our cyclones are becoming more destructive, on top of rising sea levels, increased storm surges, and also changes in things like the monsoon season. Globally, after decades of starting to get on top of the food problem, global hunger is yet again on the rise, driven by changes in climate. And last year was truly an exceptional year for extreme weather all over the world. We had record-breaking North Atlantic hurricanes. We had some of the worst Asian monsoon floods for many years. We had extreme heat waves in many parts of the world. And even inside the Arctic Circle, in places like Siberia, we saw temperatures in the high 30s. This was truly unprecedented. Sorry. But the good news is that despite the scale of these enormous losses already, and the even greater losses that will occur as we go over that 1.5 degrees, there still remains enormous amounts of great and wonderful things that we can protect. So as Will said, every fraction of a degree that we can avoid really matters. So what are the solutions? Well, Australia has to be part of the solution because we're a huge part of the problem. Not only do we burn a lot of fossil fuels at home, we're the second largest exporter of fossil fuels to the world. So do not let anybody tell you that we only play a small role in this. We are a big part of the problem. We have to be a big part of the solution. What we've done in this report is calculate what we think should be Australia's fair share of global effort over the next decade and beyond. And these calculations were based on both our past and current emissions, our capacity, that is our level of economic development, how easy it is to reduce emissions because we have such a wonderful renewable energy resource, and the feasibility of reaching the goals that we've set. And we've actually used some of the same methodology that was used in 2014 by the Climate Change Authority. So we come to what might seem like a startling conclusion, but we think it's justified in the report that Australia should aim to reduce its emissions by 75% below 2005 levels by 2030. Now, this is about triple the current pledge that Australia has made under the Paris Climate Agreement, which, as many of you would know, is for a reduction of 26 to 28% by 2030 compared to 2005. We think we need to treble this level of ambition. Furthermore, we believe Australia, to do its fair share, must reach net zero by 2035 for two reasons. Firstly, we should do it because we've been a laggard internationally in climate action and we've got a lot of catching up to do. And secondly, we can do it because of our technology and our renewable resources. So how? Well, it's not to say it's not going to be hard. It requires an immense effort from all of us, everything in the Australian society. Our colleagues at ClimateWorks have modelled a pathway for Australia to be net zero, so these plans exist. But we must address every sector of our economy, from agriculture to electricity to transport to buildings to everything. But this represents a major opportunity for the country because, as I said, we've got some of the best renewable resources in the world. We've got a skilled workforce and we've got markets in Asia that are already very strong. Limiting warming, as Will said earlier, to well below 2 degrees is absolutely fundamental for protecting all of us, our way of life, our children's future. And failure is really not an option. The good news is that the rest of the world is moving forward. While the Australian federal government still is clinging by their fingernails to 18th century energy technology, the rest of the world is really getting on board with what they need to do. We saw at the Biden summit just recently that the US has announced that they will aim to halve their emissions by 2030. Japan has released an emissions reduction target of 46% by 2030. Canada has stepped up with a target of 40 to 45%. We've seen the EU with 55%, and we've even seen the UK with a Conservative government say that they want to reduce their emissions by 68% by 2030. These are really extraordinary ambitions, and we need to be part of that action. We have, of course, the solutions. We know that our state and territory governments, our local governments, our businesses and our industries are stepping up to take action. Public support is also high and continues to grow. The ABC's Australia Talks identified climate change as a top 10 problem. 63% agreed that it was a huge problem. Just yesterday or the day before, I think, the Lowy Climate Institute released its latest poll on attitudes to climate change of Australians, with 60% of us saying that global warming is a serious and pressing problem and we need to be taking steps now, even if it involves significant costs. This is actually a 4-point rise since last year. 70% of us said we need to join other countries in the lead up to the COP meeting in Glasgow in November to increase our commitments. 91% said that they would support the federal government providing subsidies for the development of renewable energy technology, and 77% supported more subsidies for electric vehicle purchases. So the community across Australia is really on board. The Climate Council a few months back released a Clean Jobs plan showing that by stepping up our climate change ambition is a great economic opportunity for jobs and growth. We did some clean jobs modelling for each of the states and came up with 20 plus aligned policy announcements. We had a big Queensland focus because, of course, Queensland currently has quite a lot of jobs in coal. We want to get them out of coal and into clean jobs. The next steps of the Climate Council are to ensure these policies are implemented in every state, to work with all the state governments to increase their ambitions and to reduce the barriers to action, to keep communicating that clean jobs are the way forward and create a virtuous cycle. We are really focused on Queensland in our engagement program at the moment. We've just released a specific clean jobs package for Queensland, and we continue to work with business and industry to engage them in this task. I'd like to give a shout out also to our Growing Cities Power Partnership, which is our scheme to bring local governments on board. We now have 147 local governments in the partnership. And some of you may have been listening to and participating in the Cities Power Partnership conference, which has been going on in the last 2 days, today and yesterday, where there's been enormous numbers of ideas put forward as to how local governments can act. Our Climate Media Centre, of course, and I think Dinah will probably be talking more about this, has been training up our trusted voices to speak out. We have now 140 core spokespeople from right across Australia. The CMC's trained now more than 1,000 Australians on how to speak publicly about climate change and provides comms advice and media advice to hundreds of grassroots organisations. Using these people and these organisations expands our reach even more than we at the Climate Council can do. And I'll leave it there, stop my sharing and pass on to Dinah.
Thanks a lot, Lesley. And yeah, thanks for the reminder as well that CPP obviously had their national summit the past 2 days, and Lesley's presentation was a really good segue from the stark reality of the science that Will presented and the impacts Lesley presented, and then of course, true to Climate Council, we don't just talk about the problem, we talk about the solutions. And then now as part of the solution as well, Dinah, I should also say in the intro to Dinah led the Climate Media Centre when it started off as well. So Dinah's going to talk us through the comms research and the Aim High, Go Fast, and also some comms tips for talking about these challenging and also exciting issues when it comes to the solutions. Dinah?
Thanks, Marty. So I will share my screen also. Here we go. First, I'd like to acknowledge I'm joining this special briefing from Wurundjeri country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining this event today. I'd also like to send out some virtual hugs if there's any Victorians out there like myself, just trying to get your head around another lockdown. So how to have conversations that cut through. One of the first rules of effective communication is know thy audience. So we all need to start with the fundamental recognition that people are different. So it shouldn't come as any surprise that we all have different psychological, cultural and political reasons for acting or not acting to cut greenhouse gas emissions.
Dinah, sorry, can you just go on to the slide view? I think we've got your notes there.
Oh, sorry, apologies, guys. I'll just stop share and try again. Sorry. Thanks, Marty.
That's all right. There we go.
Is that better?
Yep, try that one.
Okay, cool. So this here is what I like to think of as a kind of a spectrum of climate concern. The Sunrise Project commissioned this piece of research last year, and it was about grouping Australians aged 16 years and over into the 7 types that you can see named here. And it also gives you a sense of what proportion of our population fits into any of those groups. So you can see that on the left-hand side, there's the highly engaged and deeply concerned about climate change, which I imagine would be most, if not all, of the people joining us today on this call, right across to those Australians who pretty much, as the image demonstrates, sort of have that hand up. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to acknowledge it. They kind of refuse to engage. So what we did in our research was looked at a few groups in detail to explore how they were feeling and how they responded to information and messaging around the urgency of our issue. And in one set of focus groups, we had that alarmed and alert audiences, and in the other, we had cautious and doubtful. And we refined our messaging based on that initial stage of research and then tested that across all audiences using some polling. So we found many differences, but the first point here that I wanted to note was something that those 2 quite different audiences had in common. So across those 2 groups, where we have the alert, alarmed, and cautious and doubtful, both agreed that there were benefits and opportunities in taking climate action. So they can see the opportunity, they can see the good news story. Most group participants across the different segments of audience thought that Australia should be doing more. The alarmed and alert saw that we have, high degrees of wealth, education, those natural resources that Lesley referred to, that, present some really amazing opportunities for us. And the more cautious, doubtful audiences were quite excited by the fact that this might mean more investment in research and technology, and that we might be exporting our renewable goods to the rest of the world. What this sort of graph shows you is, I guess, when you ask people what's the best reason for climate action, you can start to see some differences between those audiences in terms of what, I guess, most excites them. So you'll see reducing reliance on foreign fuels is notably higher in the cautious and the doubtful audiences. So that was that light blue bar there. Whereas investing and creating jobs in growing renewable industries is by far the most popular among the audiences who are most concerned about climate change. So that's that dark blue bar that you can see there. So it's just interesting to note that, I guess, again, people have different motivations. And so when talking to different groups of people, we might be emphasising different outcomes or different benefits from climate action. The next thing we were keen to test was whether or not Australians think our country should be out there leading the pack. What we found was that there's a bit of a mix. Mostly Australians think our country should be keeping up with the rest of the world when it comes to climate action. So the fear of being left behind by our political allies, by our strategic trading partners, creates a sense of urgency for climate action amongst those audiences that are less engaged in this issue. Both those different groups that we explored this messaging with understood that net zero commitments from trading partners and others really puts a pressure on Australia to do more. So I'll come back to that a little bit later. But again, once we start sort of breaking that down into who exactly thinks what, this shows you who thinks we should be moving first. There's actually a big proportion of people who do think we should be moving first, but when you look into who that is, that drive for Australia to lead is actually majority coming from younger people. So 49% of 18 to 34-year-olds want us to take the lead versus 28% of those aged 55 and over. Similarly, those that are already really concerned about climate change also want us to be leading. But when you start looking at the groups that are less engaged or less concerned, they're much more in favour of Australia keeping up with other countries, and they do worry about us being left behind. The next thing I want to mention is how a positive story about the things we can do that will make a difference, and highlighting economic opportunities brings lots of different types of people together. It's something that I guess can collectively capture people's imagination. So messaging around risks and threat of climate change do engage alarm audiences a lot, but they can deter some of those that are less engaged. And it's interesting to note that the cautious and doubtful audiences prefer collective language. They want to feel like they're part of something rather than they're out on their own, or you know, no one else is, get that sense that no one else is really doing anything. So, you know, it won't make a difference if they do. The last thing I wanted to mention was that global warming works best across audiences in making a direct and immediate link to impacts that we experience often in Australia. So the group discussions showed that a term climate change doesn't really resonate with the alarmed audience because it doesn't fit our worldview. We see that this is a crisis already, so it doesn't have that kind of sense of urgency that a lot of people have referred to in this session. But on the flip side, when you do use terms like climate crisis and climate emergency, while that makes sense to those alarmed and alert audiences, it doesn't fit the worldview of people that aren't engaged as much in this issue and have those lower levels of concern. They look out the window and to them, everything looks fine. So when you talk in that way, they're kind of like, nah, that doesn't sound right to me. And they tend to switch off or stop listening. So again, just something to note that when you use particular phrases or particular kind of framings with people, audiences can react quite differently. Now I'll just get on to a bit of our advice from the conversation guide that hopefully everyone's seen, or if you haven't seen, you can access from our website. So we talk about degrees of danger. There's a very good reason for that. One is there's no safe level of global warming. So when you kind of position particular temperature rises as being, you know, beyond that limit is unsafe. So therefore people interpret that as under that limit is safe. We're already experiencing terrible consequences. Lesley outlined many of those. So it's really important that people understand it's here, it's happening, and it's hurting us already in many different ways. The other thing we talk about, and we've mentioned a few times, is that concept of every fraction of degree matters. When we frame climate action as a choice between a miracle or an apocalypse, neither of those scenarios will unfold tomorrow. It's that slower burn and longer term that we're talking about. So Kate Marvel put it well when she used the analogy of climate change not being a cliff we fall off, but a slope that we slide down. And you can see that as the temperatures keep rising, the consequences keep worsening. The next piece of advice we have is focusing on those concrete steps and immediate decade. So the first thing that we try to get across to people is that not only do we need to do more, but we also need to do it faster. Speed matters. We can see that from Professor Steffen's presentation that climate change is worsening, and we need our response to match that scale and speed. We also need to redefine what credible climate action is, and so people understand that the lion's share of emissions cuts need to happen this decade. So we're not stuck in a political debate about net zero by 2050. Growing international momentum is a huge motivator. So coming back to what I talked about earlier, talking about what's happening around the world and giving people a sense that Australia is being left behind really does increase the sense of urgency amongst those less engaged audiences. So there's two sides to that coin. There's the risks of inaction to Australia, and there's also the opportunities and benefits from acting earlier that you can talk about. The next point is sort of a general comms approach, but it's about connecting with values rather than numbers. And we always pay attention to people like ourselves. I'm a parent, and I certainly notice the conversations that other parents are having. I love my AFL, and I will pay attention to what sports fans are saying, and so on and so forth. But thinking about the idea that different things motivate different people, it's why it's so important that we hear from all sorts of Australians on this issue. And it's why we set up the Climate Media Centre back in 2015, because we needed to hear from all those Australians that were worried and seeing different impacts and experiencing different things. We needed to hear from all of them because they reach different sorts of people. So think about why you care, what you think we have to gain by acting, and what you think we risk by failing to act quickly enough. And that should be front and centre, more so than any specific targets or policies. And the last point I'd like to make is give people a boost of confidence. I don't know about everyone else, but I think sometimes when you hear climate change news, you can feel a little bit like crawling under the quilt and pulling it over your head and just hiding for a bit. It's very easy to feel overwhelmed. And, you know, we're talking about a systematic change, massive on a global scale. We haven't seen it before. Many people agree that we do need to do more. But when it comes to what can we do, is it possible, there's a lot of doubt still in people's mind. So giving people the confidence that it can be done is a great thing to do. And the easiest way to do that is to focus on the positive things that are already underway and the progress that is already being made. So I'd encourage you to point out those good news stories. And there are actually some amazing good news stories to see when you start looking. And that's it for me.
Great, thanks a lot, Dinah. So with everyone's been busy typing away and getting some really good questions in there. So what we'll do is we'll open up the floor. I've got some questions here that just looking at what participants have been asking. So just open up firstly to the panelists, I can answer as well for some of them. So given the level of climate change denial in the federal government, how do we get cut through with the government itself?
It's a very good question. If anyone has the answer, I'd love to know it. I think, yeah, I mean, our approach is a couple of things. I think there's a real pressure point from international action on the Australian government. It's something that they haven't experienced in the past, and certainly up until when Trump was lost the election. A particular pressure point is around the economic ramifications. So things like the European Union talking about carbon tariffs. The other thing that they are really worried about is if that cautious, doubtful audience changes their minds a bit more around climate change. So it's another area that we're really focused on, because we think that they need to know the real ramifications of what's going on. And if they do realise that, then I think they won't be happy with the federal government either.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Lesley was talking about, obviously, the tragic bushfires over Black Summer, and looking on the reflection of that, it really was maddening seeing the response initially. And obviously Greg Mullins and the emergency leaders for climate action came out early and strong, saying, you know, this is a disaster waiting to happen. The season's going to unfold, and we need to be ready. And yet it was really interesting watching how the government also changed its language and position. It was under enormous pressure. And I think the Black Summer fires, the penny dropped for many about the enormity of climate change and the impacts and what we need to be doing. I think Dinah's right about international pressure as well. So, you know, Conservative governments, Boris Johnson's been on the phone, you know, when he came into power, and he's been really pressurizing the Australian government. And we saw that play out, and we will continue to see that play out leading into Glasgow and the COP and the G7 in June. Will and Lesley, do you got anything to add on that?
Oh, Martin, all I'll say is I guess we do get kind of fixated on the federal government, but it's very clear that everybody else in Australia, especially the state and territory and local governments, are acting despite the federal government, not because of them. So I think we've still got to keep focusing on the action that is happening and not get completely depressed and overwhelmed by the fact that the federal government is not acting. I mean, remember that this particular government only made it in by 1 seat. I think there's going to be tremendous amount of action supporting climate action independence at the next election, you know, hoping to emulate what Zali Steggall did in Warringah. There's already lots and lots of groups promoting independence in other marginal or even safe electorates, with climate change action being their #1 message. So let's hope that as we come into the next election, whenever that might be, that those voices are amplified.
Thanks, Lesley. So I mean, you talked about the positive action there at the subnational level, and there was a question here from Karen about the Margaret River, Augusta Margaret River Shire. They've adopted a climate action plan, and they've set forward a net zero emissions by 2030. So I think that's really exciting, and we've noted that obviously with the Cities Power Partnership, it's at that level. Cities are really, and towns are really leading the way when it comes to climate action. Also at the household level, when you look at the number of households that have solar power, and that's not just a climate lens, it's also an economic lens. So people understand that you can actually benefit. There's many benefits and opportunities to tackling climate change. So I'm just going to link in that question a bit with the socialization of our report, Aim High, Go Fast, and the targets themselves and the briefings that we did. So Will, Dinah, and I could add to this, can you just let everyone know a little bit about some of the process for the briefings that we went with key stakeholders leading into the launch and afterwards?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, we went through quite a series of briefings in the NGO world and beyond to talk about, in my case, obviously the scientific basis, but also talking on the impacts and risks with Lesley, and I think importantly with Dinah, talking about how we communicate this. So this has been a long process. I think it's been very valuable to do this because it is, in some ways, it's confronting, particularly the need to really move fast, as we say in the title of our report. So I think it did require a fair bit of groundwork to make sure that what we were trying to achieve here is well understood. And I think we did a pretty good job of that. Dinah and Lesley may want to.
Yeah, the only thing I'd note just from what Will was saying was that business in particular, I think, responds to this news in a, oh, is it really that bad? Okay. And their minds are already ticking over onto, right, what else can we do? What else do we need to do? So I think there's huge opportunity there. If business and industry understands where we're at and how quickly things are moving, I think that we can see some real acceleration in that space.
Yep. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Dinah. Just there's so much to, oh, Dinah, just on the climate compass. So was that done or before or after the 2019-2020 bushfires?
That was done after, so it was completed late in 2020.
Okay. So just, Lesley, just thinking about some of the solutions that you presented, what do you think are some of the most exciting solutions that we have at our disposal?
Well, of course, some of the most effective solutions are solutions that we've had all along. I think, you know, we can't delay action waiting for new technology that we haven't invented yet, because we've got the technology in our hands. I mean, Australia was extremely instrumental in developing the first solar panels, for example, and they're getting more and more efficient all the time. You know, a few years down the track, we might be putting tiles on our roofs that are actually solar panels. Solar cells are being embedded in all sorts of building materials and other technologies. We're seeing enormous strides forward in other countries in the electric vehicle industry, with almost all of the world's major automobile manufacturers now actually putting a sunset clause on petrol and diesel driven cars and saying, you know, for example, Volkswagen and Volvo and all of those companies are rapidly phasing out combustion engines and bringing in electric vehicles. Australia is still very much behind in that, but I can speak personally that there's nothing quite so satisfying as having an electric vehicle charging in your driveway from your solar panels and then driving away on sunshine. So, you know, as we move forward in that direction, there's enormous benefits. But I just think communities coming together, investing collectively in wind and solar and pumped hydro plants is really exciting. Developments of microgrids, you know, and now feeding seaweed to cattle in the agriculture industry to reduce methane emissions. There's so much happening and there's so much opportunity, and Australian businesses and industries are at the forefront of many of those innovations.
Thanks, Lesley. Just reflecting on your comments on EVs, and I don't know if who watched the Charlie Pickering show recently, talking about how Norway really led the way with EV uptake, and it was actually pop band AHA, and they had an electric car, and they say we're not paying the tolls, and they would go through and zoom around, and they kept on getting stopped and fined, and because they had such a profile, they elevated the issue, electric vehicles. And then you see Norway actually with the tax incentives, the financial incentives, the policy regulations, and you get that real uptake of new technologies. Yeah. And I don't know if anyone's seen the Super Bowl ad as well with the EVs in the US with Will Ferrell. So that was a great one too.
In fact, last year, I believe nearly 75% of all new vehicles sold in Norway were electric vehicles, and here it was 0.74%. So we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, that's right. And here, Will, I'm surprised you're not wearing I Love Canberra t-shirt. So Will's based in Canberra, and for anyone that knows Will, he's a big fan of Canberra. So obviously ACT and Canberra are doing really incredible things when it comes to climate action. Can you just give us some of the exciting examples, Will?
Yeah, I think we were a leader in going 100% renewable. And I recall I was on the ACT Climate Change Council, a group of us advising government. They were very nervous in 2011 to do that, because at that time solar was reasonably high and so on. But they bit the bullet and said, we are going to do it. They rode the cost curve down. Now our electricity prices are lower than most around the country. Unlike our federal government, we are promoting EVs. We're going to electric buses. We're putting in EV charging stations around the city. We're extending our light rail, which is run on 100% renewable. And now we're going after built infrastructure. So the big extension to Canberra Hospital is all electric, running on renewable. We're promoting all electric housing. We're actually banning gas of any type for any purpose in new buildings in Canberra. So gas is out. And it's hugely popular. So the thing is, it's hard to get started, but once you get that momentum, people see the benefits, they see the advantages. The next step becomes easier, becomes faster, and that's how you attack the problem.
See, I told you. Yeah, I mean, you just can't get enough of Canberra and ACT,
Yeah.
can you, Will?
Pity the Raiders are down a bit this year, but anyway.
Oh, well, that's a good segue, because obviously I love sport, you love sport, Dinah loves sport. Lesley, no, but you did a good effort with our sport report as well that we launched recently. So I guess I'm getting away to the Dinah. Can you just unpack a little bit about the importance of communicating to conservative audiences and what we can do?
Well, I think I just, as I mentioned earlier, the federal government really talks to a specific type of Australian. And when you look at the way they're communicating, they've worked out pretty precisely a small band of voters that they're trying to appeal to, that are either, as we all know, sitting already in marginal seats for the government, either the Liberals or the Nationals, or they're influential in marginal seats that Labor or Independents might hold. So appealing to that smaller section of Australia, which are the more cautious and conservative voter, is really critical, because depending on how they view the issue will depend on how they're receiving those messages and framing from the federal government. So trying to sort of change their perspective on, for example, positioning climate action as an economic opportunity rather than a cost, and climate inaction as the true cost, I think that's really critical.
Great, thanks a lot, Dinah. So we've run out of time actually, and I think it's fantastic turnout. And as was said earlier, I mean, we've obviously got many actually from Melbourne today. So our hearts and thoughts go out to you in Melbourne, and also just like to thank the panelists for their contribution today. Just next steps, so we'll be continuing to socialise the targets that we've set. We'll continue, as the Climate Council is always, to demand strong, bold climate action. We've got many opportunities leading up on the road to Glasgow. And as a Scot, I like to say, well, when we're in Glasgow, why don't we give climate change the Glasgow kiss and get on with it? So there's many exciting opportunities there, and Lesley's really unpacked this with the solutions. So it's really exciting. We have recorded today's session, so you can access that afterwards. And I just want to thank everyone for your time and your engagement and your continued support of the Climate Council. So thanks and good night.